Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now there are a few different RX 580 graphics cards you can buy, a 4GB model, 8GB model and a version with less cores known as the 580-2048SP, often found on sites like AliExpress. We're looking at the best of the bunch today, the standard 8GB 580 launched back in 2017. The latest 580 driver at the time of this video dates back to October 2024, and with support winding down, investing in one of these may not be the best idea, though it's not a significant outlay price-wise these days. You're looking at way less than £100 or dollars, with some going for almost half that. There are some obvious limitations right out of the box. One of my favourite games to come out recently, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, won't work because it requires hardware ray tracing, which the 580 doesn't have. This isn't a common requirement right now, thankfully, so most games will start and run. Oh, apart from Spider-Man 2. This just tells me that my graphics card is too old and then crashes. I swear I got this message the other day with a different card, but then it ran anyway. Maybe the game got updated or something, or it just doesn't like the 24.9.1 drivers. I'm not saying the game would run well if it had started, but at least we could have had a bit of fun tweaking the settings. But that's all for the errors. For the games that do work, I tried to target either 30 FPS or 60 FPS depending on how demanding it was and how big the graphical sacrifices needed to be. For example, if we start with Stalker 2, I targeted 30 frames per second, as no amount of upscaling or drops to the native resolution would make 60 FPS possible. It was better to be able to sort of see everything clearly and have at least 30 FPS on average than turn it into a pixelated mess with just over 40 FPS occasionally, at least in my opinion. TSR seems to produce the highest figure out of all the upscaling methods, and I went for 50% because it's not too intensive and it doesn't make the game look too blurry. This is probably the heaviest game I tested with the 580, so it should only get better from here. In stark contrast to Stalker 2, we have Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which runs like a dream. We covered this the other day in the minimum spec PC build video, and although we can choose FSR from the menu, I found that running it at native 1080p produces 60 FPS or above a lot of the time. 61 was actually the average after half an hour of gameplay. There are some dips to the mid-50s, as you can see by the on-screen overlay, but it was really consistent, to be honest, which can be seen by the 1.1% lows. It wouldn't take much to improve these figures if you wanted to try and keep the game above 60 FPS more of the time. Even quality FSR mode should do it. I wasn't expecting much from Black Myth Wukong. I enabled FSR, set the scaling to 50% and reduced the in-game options to low. I did this expecting 30 FPS, but we actually got 60. I've got a new SSD on the way so that I can fit more games on it because I'm still using the benchmark tool here and not the full game. I've got like 30 gigabytes of space left at this point. Hopefully I'll get the full game installed again soon. It's amazing how quickly even 2 terabytes of space can be used up these days. Next up we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6. The minimum preset is the best bet for the 8GB 580, that along with FSR 1 set to ultra quality. We saw just over 60 frames per second overall with FSR off, but because this is a fast-paced online shooter, I wanted to try and retain plus 60 FPS more consistently. That did seem to be the case according to the footage, though the on-screen figures would disagree. I never saw the game drop below 62 when testing a few games on Nuketown. I used this map because there's constant action to stress our hardware, plus it's just a really fun map. My first thought with Cyberpunk 2077 was to target 30 FPS, and then I thought, nah, let's see if we can do 60. Thanks to the 8GB of VRAM, I felt comfortable with choosing the high textures, and I also went with high crowds, but this is more of a CPU intensive option. I also enabled FSR 2.1 quality. All the other options were set to their respective lowest. Honestly, I think the game still looks decent and it's running well too, with over 60 frames per second. The 580 can still offer quite surprising performance, in a good way of course. This is in part thanks to upscaling, which is ideal for situations like this, extending the life of an older GPU that may struggle a bit. It's a decent result for our near 8-year-old GPU. Time sure flies. I couldn't believe it when I looked up the launch date of this card. Counter-Strike 2 is certainly capable of more than low settings with the 580, but the more frames here the better. FSR will be enabled by default with this preset, but I turned it off this time around. We're getting almost 200 FPS, well, we seem to be hitting that occasionally, so if you have a 144Hz display, you want to play CS2 and you're on a tighter budget, then the 580 might be a decent choice. I think it's got to be one of the cheapest 8GB graphics cards around at the moment. A bit of a shame about driver support, but that doesn't seem to be too much of an issue right now, nor does the whole certain games requiring ray tracing thing. Anyway, I'm talking about anything apart from CS2 here, probably subconsciously trying to distract from my awful gameplay as per usual. Now, just like with CS2, I stuck with low settings for Fortnite. Not quite the lowest, instead I chose DX12 mode with the low preset and 100% rest scale with TAA. This actually runs really smooth. I found that I tend to get less stutter and therefore better frame times with AMD graphics cards, and that certainly seems to be the case here. We averaged well over 100 FPS with decent percentile figures too. It may not look its best at low, but the frame rate is definitely more important here in my opinion. Oh, there is no way I'm getting wiped out by a player in a banana suit. I don't say this often, but I actually really like this game. Great for a wide range of hardware as well. Next up, it was the turn of Red Dead Redemption, the original game that finally made its way to PC in 2024. I jumped straight in at Ultra without changing anything apart from motion blur, which I turned off. For anti-aliasing, I kept FSR3 enabled and set it to native AA, and overall we saw 70 frames per second. This number appeared to increase in the desert, but for the benchmark I decided to take on the entire town of Armadillo. Not the best idea, and I didn't last very long at all. I think this game still looks pretty decent actually. It first came out on PS3 and 360 in 2010, so not bad at all for a decade and a half old title. We'll move on to its successor now, Red Dead Redemption 2. I went with the ultra textures, keeping everything else at medium, including TAA, hoping for closer to 60 FPS. Again, the 580 surprised me, achieving closer to 70 overall. I do have this card paired with an i7-12700F, which probably isn't representative of the most realistic real-world scenario, but it does mean the card can hit its full potential. This is what we can expect of the 580 best case scenario. So far, I'm pretty happy with what I've seen. For a card that sits around 70 quid, sometimes less here in the UK, it really isn't bad, considering the 8GB of memory as well. Marvel Rivals up next. This is best played at the lowest settings with FSR enabled and set to quality mode. It's going to depend on the map, but we should get at least 60 FPS most of the time with these settings, and if not, you can always enable a more intensive FSR preset, though be careful because it will diminish the overall quality. Again, it's probably best to try and target 60 frames per second as it's an online competitive game, but we also don't want to destroy the visuals too much and make everything impossible to see properly. It's all about finding that nice balance. Our penultimate game is Starfield. I'm not expecting much from this one, and to prepare for the incoming slideshow, I dropped everything to the lowest, enabled FSR3, and chose 50% render resolution. There was one massive freeze with the gameplay. I thought for sure the game had crashed on us, but all of a sudden it started working. Performance-wise, we're looking at between 30 and 40 FPS with graphics that look like we should be getting more, if you know what I mean. For a game that has ended up looking like this, at these settings, I feel like performance should be better, but in all fairness, it is doing better than I thought, and we are using a near decade-old card. We'll finalise with The Witcher 3, the next-gen version. I went straight in at 1080p high with TAAU. This seems to be enough for at least 60 FPS, even in and around the city, so things should pick up a little more as we explore the more remote and less populated locations. We'll end the video here on a positive note. The 580 is still hanging in there, and I think the 8GB of VRAM helps. It's a shame about the lack of frequent driver updates, but it is an aging card, so it's understandable. For the money though, it's not bad, and if you want to play games like CS2 and Fortnite, it's a great cheap way to do so. There are still some AAA games that will work well with this card if they're well optimised, like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and I think that's what the 580 is going to have to rely on a lot more, which unfortunately, as we've seen with a lot of recent releases, isn't the case. That said, it's great to see this older, popular mainstream choice still providing some decent results today. I think upscaling plays a big part too, and it's in situations like this that I'm glad FSR exists as a tool for helping older cards perform a little better and potentially extending the time they spend in someone's gaming PC. That's all for this one then. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think of the 580 down below, and let me know if you still have one inside your gaming PC and what sort of games you play with it, of course. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.